The question feels safe. Everyone asks it. It appears in forums, fan debates, midnight rewatches of Revenge of the Sith, that aching moment on the Mustafar landing platform when everything collapses. What if Anakin had walked away? What if he had trusted Mace Windu? What if Padmé had said something different? Or the Chancellor had arrived 5 minutes later? Or the nightmares had never come? The comfortable version of this question imagines a better galaxy. Anakin stays. The Order survives. Padmé lives. The twins grow up together. The Empire never rises. Palpatine dies on the floor of his own office, his schemes finally undone by the one man he couldn't fully corrupt. The Chosen One fulfills the prophecy the way the Jedi always assumed he would, through loyalty, not through destruction, through survival, not through sacrifice. It is a beautiful story. It is also almost certainly wrong, because the question everyone asks, what if Anakin never fell, contains a hidden assumption so deeply embedded that most people never notice it. The assumption is this: that Anakin not falling would have been a correction, a restoration, a return to the path the galaxy was always supposed to travel. But the closer you look at what Anakin Skywalker actually was, not what the prophecy said, not what the Jedi believed, not what Palpatine needed, the more a different, far darker possibility begins to take shape. What if Anakin not falling wasn't a solution? What if it was a different kind of catastrophe, one the galaxy wasn't equipped to survive? Start with the Jedi Order itself, because that's where the comfortable version of this story always breaks first. The assumption is that a Jedi Anakin, loyal, powerful, uncorrupted, would have saved the Order. He would have exposed Palpatine before Order 66 could be executed. He would have stood beside Mace Windu, not against him. The Sith would have been destroyed. The clones would never have received the activation signal. The purge would never have happened. Except there's a crack in that wall immediately. The Jedi Council had already failed Anakin in ways that had nothing to do with Palpatine. They had refused to grant him the rank of Master. They had asked him to spy on his own mentor. They had sensed the darkness in him for years and chosen containment over healing. They had positioned him, deliberately, as a tool valuable, dangerous, and fundamentally untrusted. Which means that an Anakin who doesn't fall still exists inside a Jedi Order that treated him as a liability dressed in loyalty. The institutional failure doesn't disappear because Anakin stays. It deepens. If Anakin survives the confrontation at the Senate building, if Palpatine dies, if the threat is neutralized, the Jedi Council still has a problem. They have in their possession the most powerful, Force-sensitive being alive, a man who just helped kill the Supreme Chancellor in front of witnesses, a man who was never given a seat on the council he was promised, a man whose wife and unborn children were a secret, hidden from every superior he had. The council's response to that situation after the crisis is not something the comfortable version of this story examines. It should. Because the Jedi of the late Republic were not equipped to handle power without structure. They were equipped to manage it, train it, and, when necessary, suppress it. Anakin Skywalker, alive and uncorrupted, is still Anakin Skywalker, the anomaly, the exception, the man the Jedi's entire philosophical framework could not fully account for. And this is where it becomes disturbing. Consider what the post-Palpatine political landscape would have looked like. The Senate had been systematically corrupted for over a decade. Emergency powers had been normalized. The mechanisms of democratic accountability had been quietly dismantled, while the Clone Wars provided justification for every erosion. Palpatine's death does not reverse any of that. The bureaucratic rot, the compromised senators, the centralized military command, those things remain. What remains too is a Jedi Order that has just killed the Supreme Chancellor, without a trial, without a vote, without any democratic sanction whatsoever. The Jedi would have presented it as necessity, as the exposure of a Sith Lord, as the defense of the Republic. And they would not be wrong, but they would also be asking a Senate that had already surrendered most of its independence to simply believe them. To trust that the most powerful military force in the galaxy had executed its political leader for legitimate reasons and now intended to step back quietly. The implication here is that Anakin not falling does not restore the Republic. It creates a new power vacuum, and it creates one with the Jedi Order standing directly at the center of it, whether they want to be or not. Which means someone would have to decide what comes next. And that someone, almost certainly, would have been Anakin. Not because he wanted power, but because he was the only one with enough of it to matter. The Council was aging. Yoda was ancient and increasingly withdrawn, more aligned with the cosmic force than with the immediate political machinery of the galaxy. Mace Windu was brilliant and ruthless, but politically toxic, a man whose willingness to execute a sitting chancellor without hesitation would not be easy to rehabilitate in public perception, regardless of how justified it was. Obi-Wan Kenobi was a warrior and a diplomat, but not a political actor on the scale the post-war Republic would require. Anakin was different. He was famous. He was young. He was the hero of the Clone Wars, in a way that no other Jedi had become. The people of the Republic knew his name. They had watched him fight. He was, in a very real sense, the Jedi Order's most legible face, the one most capable of serving as a bridge between the Temple and the Senate, between force power and political legitimacy. That's only possible if Anakin survives, and it's also what makes his survival so structurally dangerous. A hero with power and charisma and no clear institutional role is not a stabilizing force. Not in a galaxy still reeling from a decade of war, still governed by structures that had been engineered by a Sith Lord to funnel authority upward. The question the comfortable version of this story never asks is, what does Anakin do with that position? Not what he wants to do, what the situation forces him to do. Let's step closer to Anakin himself, because this is where the version of events without his fall becomes not just politically complicated, but psychologically unstable in ways that have nothing to do with Palpatine's manipulation. Anakin Skywalker, by the time of Revenge of the Sith, was not a man in balance. He was a man in crisis. His fear of loss had not been created by Palpatine. It had been present since childhood, since the day he left his mother on Tatooine and felt the severance like something physical. It had metastasized over the years of the Clone Wars, had been watered by every near death, every separation from Padmé, every mission that brought him close to the cost of attachment and then left him to manage the aftermath alone. The nightmares about Padmé were not a tool Palpatine inserted into his mind. They were the logical culmination of a fear that had been growing untreated for over a decade. That fear doesn't go away because the Sith Lord dies. Anakin still has the capacity for the kind of love that becomes terror when threatened. He still has a wife whose pregnancy is still a secret. He still exists inside an order that explicitly forbids attachment, an order he has violated repeatedly at the deepest possible level. The hypocrisy of his position doesn't resolve itself because Palpatine is dead. It becomes, if anything, more acute, because now there is no external enemy to focus on. The war ends. The Sith are destroyed. The existential threat that had given Anakin's emotional chaos somewhere to be channeled, that threat is gone. What remains is Padmé's pregnancy. What remains is the secret. What remains is the knowledge that the Jedi Order, which had already demonstrated its willingness to use Anakin as an instrument and then keep him at arm's length, now needs to be told the truth. The most likely explanation for what happens next is not peaceful disclosure. It is fracture. Not a violent fracture, not Mustafar, not the massacre at the temple, but a slow one. The revelation that the Jedi's most celebrated member had been living in direct violation of the Order's foundational code for years. The birth of Luke and Leia into a galaxy that has just decapitated its own government. The question of what raising children means for a man who has never stopped being afraid of losing them. And this is where something darkens that most discussions of this scenario refuse to touch. Anakin Skywalker, without the fall, is not a stable actor in a stable galaxy. He is a traumatized man with immense power in an unstable political environment, whose primary emotional driver, the terror of loss, has never been addressed, never been healed, never even been named by the people responsible for his well-being. The Jedi didn't fail Anakin only by being cold. They failed him by being incurious. They sensed the darkness in him and treated it as a management problem rather than a wound that required genuine intervention. That wound is still there. Padmé still carries 2 children whose existence changes everything. The Republic is still structurally compromised. And Anakin is still Anakin, brilliant, loving, volatile, deeply afraid. What happens next depends almost entirely on what the Jedi do with the truth when it comes out. But here's the implication that's hard to ignore. The Jedi Council of the prequel era was not equipped philosophically, institutionally, or emotionally to respond to that truth with the kind of compassion it required. Yoda's doctrine on attachment was clear and inflexible. Letting go, releasing, surrendering to the will of the Force, this was the Jedi way. The idea that grief and love and the terror of loss might require active healing rather than passive detachment was not part of the Order's vocabulary. It was, in fact, precisely the failure that Anakin had already exposed by existing. If the Council confronted Anakin about Padmé and they would have, the confrontation would not have looked like therapy. It would have looked like judgment. And Anakin's response to judgment had never been quiet. Not because he was evil, but because he was a person who had been told his entire emotional life was wrong and had learned to survive that verdict by burying what he felt rather than transforming it. What happens next reframes everything. Because here's what this means. The version of Anakin who doesn't fall doesn't escape the Jedi Order's structural incapacity to deal with him. He runs directly into it, but this time without Palpatine's alternative waiting at the end of the corridor. Without a dark side option, Anakin's choices collapse into a very different set of possibilities. He can comply, suppress, deny, accept the Council's judgment, surrender Padmé, or surrender the Order. He can leave, abandon the Jedi entirely, exist outside the structure, raise his children in exile. Or he can fight not with a lightsaber, but with the political weight he has accumulated, with the public trust he carries, with the simple fact that the Jedi Order cannot afford to lose him publicly, and he knows it. None of those paths are simple. None of them are safe. And all of them reshape the galaxy in ways that have nothing to do with the Emperor's design. Which means the prophecy itself starts to look different. If Anakin was always destined to bring balance, if that was the design, the intention, the direction of the Force itself, then what did balance actually require? The Jedi were not in balance, not even close. They were numerous, powerful, and philosophically calcified an institution that had existed for so long that it had confused its own continuation with the health of the Force. The Sith were 2. The Jedi were thousands. Whatever balance meant in this context, it almost certainly didn't mean more Jedi. The implication is quiet and unsettling. Perhaps what the prophecy always required was not the survival of Anakin Skywalker, but his transformation. And perhaps transformation, real transformation, the kind that changes the structure of things rather than just the personnel, always requires destruction as part of its mechanism, not darkness for its own sake, not cruelty, but the necessary undoing of what had calcified If that's true, then Anakin not falling doesn't fulfill the prophecy. It delays it. Play the scenario forward another generation. Anakin survives. Palpatine is dead. Luke and Leia are born not in hiding, not separated, but into whatever complicated reality their parents have built in the wreckage of the late Republic. They grow up together. They know who they are. And this is where the consequences start to cascade in ways that the comfortable version of this scenario never follows to their conclusion. Luke Skywalker, as we know him, was shaped by absence, by the mystery of his father, by the longing for something larger than the life he had, by the specific texture of growing up in hidden exile on a desert world, watching the sky, dreaming of elsewhere. That particular version of Luke, the one who becomes the hero, who carries the hope of the rebellion, who is willing to throw down his lightsaber in front of the Emperor because he believes his father can still be reached, that Luke is a product of exactly the loss that Anakin spent his whole life trying to prevent. And Anakin, who never fell, produces a different Luke, one who grew up with power, with legacy, with the weight of being the son of the most famous Jedi in the galaxy and the most celebrated hero of the Clone Wars. One whose relationship with the Force was shaped not by mystery and yearning, but by inheritance and expectation. That Luke might be exceptional, might be powerful, might even be good. But the specific quality that makes Luke in Return of the Jedi capable of what he does, the willingness to be vulnerable, to refuse the logic of strength, to reach for his father's soul instead of his throat, that quality is not guaranteed by genes or midichlorians. It was formed by circumstance, by the particular shape of his wound, which raises a darker possibility. If Luke doesn't carry that specific wound, who saves the galaxy from the next Palpatine? Because there will be one. Not necessarily Palpatine himself, but the structure that produced Palpatine, the web of corruption and ambition and institutional failure that allowed a Sith Lord to climb to the Senate's highest seat over the course of decades. That structure does not dissolve just because Palpatine dies. The darkness that allowed the Empire to rise was not one man's invention. It was a symptom. Palpatine was the most sophisticated actor in a system that had been producing actors like him for a very long time. Destroy the actor. The system remains. And Anakin Skywalker, for all his power, was not a system changer. He never had been. He was a force of nature inside structures. Other people had built either the Jedi's structure or Palpatine's, with brief, desperate intervals where he tried to find something of his own. The version of him who doesn't fall is still that person. Still the most powerful individual in the galaxy. Still not the political architect that rebuilding a just republic would require. Padmé might have been. But Padmé, as we saw in the films, was already exhausted, already disillusioned. The woman who watched the Senate cheer for its own subjugation had already begun to lose her faith in the institutions she had spent her life defending. Whether that exhaustion would have cured itself in the absence of the specific trauma of Anakin's fall, whether she would have found some renewed purpose, some second wind, is genuinely unknowable. But the most likely explanation is that without the fall to define the stakes, without the specific horror of what Anakin became as a North Star for everything she was fighting against, Padmé would have found the politics of Reconstruction just as grinding, just as compromised, just as capable of crushing the soul. This detail changes how we see the saga, because what the saga actually is underneath the lightsabers and the Force and the mythology is a story about what destruction costs and what it produces. The destruction of the Republic produced the Empire. But the Empire, in its very monstrousness, produced the rebellion, produced Luke, produced the specific conditions under which redemption became possible. There is a version of Star Wars where everything goes better at the beginning, where Anakin holds, where the Order survives, where the galaxy is spared 20 years of darkness and the billions of lives that darkness consumed. But there is a question embedded in that version that the comfortable reading never fully confronts. In a galaxy spared that darkness who carries the wound that makes wisdom possible, the Jedi, in the version where they survive, have been saved from their worst failure, but they haven't learned from it. The arrogance that produced the failure, the certainty that their own judgment was sufficient, that attachment was weakness, that power needed no interrogation that survives too, protected by the very success that removed the consequences. Institutions that survive near misses without understanding them tend to carry the seed of the original failure forward. The near miss becomes proof of resilience. The lesson that should have been extracted gets buried under the relief of continuation. The implication here is that a surviving Jedi Order might have been more dangerous than a dead one. Not immediately, not obviously, but in the long arc of generations, in the slow return of calcification, of certainty, of the quiet institutional assumption that the Force was on their side, because it had always been before the conditions that produced Palpatine's rise might have reassembled themselves, differently, more slowly, but with the same structural logic. And this time, without Anakin Skywalker scarred, broken, and ultimately capable of one final act of genuine sacrifice as the failsafe. Because that's what Vader was. In the end, the man who finally ended Palpatine's direct power was not Luke. Luke was the catalyst, the love that made the act possible. But the act itself, the physical fact of picking up the Emperor and throwing him into the reactor core, came from Anakin. From the ruin of Anakin. From a man who had spent 23 years as an instrument of darkness, and who, in one moment, used everything that darkness had built in him to undo its source. That version of salvation is only available because of the fall, which means the question, what if Anakin never fell, might actually be asking the wrong thing. The right question might be darker, might be this. What if the fall was necessary not as tragedy, not as failure, not as the worst thing that happened to the galaxy, but as the specific mechanism by which the only real destruction of the Sith became possible? What if the man who threw Palpatine into the void could only have been Darth Vader, not Anakin Skywalker as he was, not Anakin Skywalker as he might have become, but specifically the person who had suffered everything Palpatine had made him suffer and had finally, at the last possible moment, found the limit of his tolerance? The implication is hard to ignore. Anakin never falling might not produce a better galaxy. It might produce a galaxy where the final destruction of the Sith is not Luke standing over his fallen father, removing the mask, seeing the man for the first time. It might produce a galaxy where that moment, that specific, irreplaceable moment, simply never happens. And if that moment never happens, then whatever came next would have needed to be something else entirely, something we don't have a name for yet, something the galaxy had never prepared for because it had never needed to. What that something would have been, and whether it would have been better or worse than the 23 years of empire and rebellion and desperate hope that the fall actually produced, is a question the comfortable version of this story has never been willing to sit with for very long. It's easier to mourn the fall, to grieve what was lost, to imagine the version where the boy from Tatooine never had to become the thing that haunted the nightmares of a generation. But grief isn't analysis. And the Force, if it cares about anything at all, has never appeared to be particularly interested in what's easier. If the Chosen One's purpose was always to break what had calcified, to bring down not just the Sith, but the conditions that kept creating them, then a version of Anakin who remained inside those conditions, however nobly, might have been the version of Anakin least capable of fulfilling what he was. Not because darkness was necessary for its own sake, but because some walls only fall from the inside, and the only person positioned to stand inside that wall for long enough, and at the right moment, and with enough of what darkness builds and still find his way back, was a man who had already lost everything. Twice, If you want more Star Wars truths that are rarely examined, you know where to find them. And before you go, the question the comfortable version of this story never answers. If Anakin had never fallen, do you think the Jedi Order would have eventually destroyed itself anyway? Or was Anakin the only thing standing between the galaxy and something even worse than the Empire? Leave your answer below. The thread is going to be interesting. Don't forget to subscribe. These are the questions